Okay, good morning, everybody from Japan. It's just before 10 a.m. here. I want to talk again about Sir Ernest Satow, my main topic, and this time his retirement. And I'll try and make the video a bit shorter than previous ones, simply because perhaps you kind of lose heart if you see a long one. So, okay. So here's the topic on the screen now. Did Sir Ernest Satow turn his back on Japan in his retirement? I gave this presentation, it was only a 20-minute presentation actually, to the EAJS conference at Tsukuba University, September 14th to 15th, 2019. EAJS is the European Association for Japanese Studies. And as you can see, the date, time and place were as written there. So quite a recent PowerPoint, in fact, compared with other ones that I've shown you. Okay, shall we get started? And the next one. I want the next one. There we are. Okay, so it's a very simple outline. Satow's life and career as a scholar diplomat from 1843 to 1929. Satow and Japan, and then his retirement from 1906 to 1929. And this is Satow in 1903 on leave from China, his final posting as a diplomat, when he was minister, initially High Commissioner and then minister in China at Peking, or Beijing as we say now. Okay, let's go. Number 3. Satow's life and career summarized here. Born in London in 1843, he attended Mill Hill School in the north of London and University College London. He read his degree in 2 years, took his first bachelor's degree in 2 years. He applied to the consular service and became a student interpreter in 1861. And he was in China from 1861 to 2. Then in Japan for quite a long time in the consular service, served then in the diplomatic service in Siam, Thailand as we call it, Uruguay and Morocco, then returned to Japan as minister, top diplomat at the time, back to China to finish off his career and retirement, and he died in 1929. Satow and Japan. So in the 1860s, he was by far the best linguist in the British legation, indispensable in the complex negotiations with the shogunate, the court, Satsuma and Choshu domains, etc. He was information gathering, interpreting. See a diplomat in Japan for the details about all of that. In the 1870s, he deepened his knowledge of Japan with many visits to the interior. He wrote many papers for the Asiatic Society of Japan, of which he was a founder member in 1871. See his diaries for the period, which I have published. He returned to Japan as minister, and then see his diaries for this period, which I have also published. Retirement. He left the diplomatic service in 1906, though he served as one of the British delegates to the Hague Peace Conference in 1907. There he had contact with the Japanese delegation, especially Tsukuba. Those things in light blue text are in fact hyperlinks, but we can't really go into them here. Suzuki Keiroku, the stepson of Inoue Kaoru and Sato Aimaro. But of course, he also had contact with many people from other delegations. He settled away from London in Devon at Ottery St. Mary. He avoided the Japan Society. He wrote reviews on Japan and China for the Athenaeum for a while. He occasionally had contact with Japanese visitors and attended a banquet in honor of Field Marshal Prince Fushimi at Buckingham Palace on May the 7th, 1907, but he declined to attend all events in honor of the visit of the Crown Prince Emperor Showa, including a banquet at Buckingham Palace in 1921. So he was probably felt he was too old by then to be rushing up to London. He only left Britain twice during his retirement, in 1907 to go to The Hague on official business, as mentioned above, and in 1914 to visit his cousin Lysinka in Blankenburg in the Harz region of Germany. And he never went back to Asia. So physically, he was never in Asia once more after 1906. Okay, so this is Satow at the Hague. I don't want to say much about this. And then we have letters, letters to and from his friends. John Harrington Gubbins, Frederick Victor Dickins, William George Aston, Lord Reay, who had no Japan experience, Lionel Berners Cholmondeley, who was a chaplain of the British legation for a long time in Tokyo, Basil Hall Chamberlain, mainly birthday greetings, 9 letters in general correspondence, and Alan Shand, 51 letters in general correspondence. Right, and continue. John Gubbins, 1852 to 1929, was formerly the Japanese secretary under Satow in 1895 to 1900. His main work seems to have been reporting on articles in the Japanese press, summarizing and translating them, which was the normal work of the Japanese secretary at the legation. He corresponded with Satow from 1908 to 27 with gaps. He was a frequent guest of Satow at Beaumont House, Ottery, St. Mary. He taught Japanese at Oxford University for 3 years, 1909 to 12, but the classes were closed for lack of students, alas. And he wrote histories of Japan, including The Progress of Japan, The Making of Modern Japan. Satow read the proofs for the latter. His A Diplomat in Japan was published 1 year earlier by the same publisher, Seeley Service and Company. So he still had Japan very much on his mind. They were both consulted regarding qualifications for teachers of Japanese at the School of Oriental Studies, including Henry Bonar, who was already appointed. And see Gubbins' letters to Satow, February 21st, 1918 and following. And there's the paper's reference, Satow paper's reference. Okay, so this is Gubbins. And Satow expressed concern about Japanese ambitions to Gubbins. They are great soldiers, sailors, and diplomats, he says, but presciently he fears an attack on Hong Kong and the Philippines. This is a letter of 1917. He discusses Butsudan, that's Buddhist altars, and Kamidana with Gubbins, and he discusses the Shimonoseki indemnity in detail. That's the indemnity for the 1860s business, where the Choshu clan closed the straits to foreign shipping. Okay, Frederick Dickins was a naval surgeon, barrister, Japanologist, university administrator, and a botanist, and he shared this hobby with Satow. He was in Japan 1863 to 65 as a naval surgeon. He returned to Japan in 1871 and established his legal practice, and then returned to England in 1879. Satow's letters to Dickins from 1906 to his death are in the papers, Satow papers. He expresses reluctance to write about Japanese matters because it would, I am sure, prove difficult to avoid making use of knowledge acquired in consequence of my official position at Tokyo. And that was strictly forbidden. He wrote of Lafcadio Hearn that he exaggerated Japanese virtues and saw their mental and social qualities through a misty pair of subjective spectacles. And here is Dickins. And Satow writes, many Japanese I like very much, but for all that, I cannot bring myself to believe they are equal to the European, I mean, taking the best of both. He continued expressing admiration and confessed that the Japanese nation has achieved far more than I had ever thought possible up to 1895. In previous times, they had been listless, but had woken up with great energy. He thought they had a great deal of the painstaking, plodding character of the German, little of the brilliancy of the French mind or the fine gold of the English genius at its best. He also said that the Japanese has no humor. He is far too serious. And then I went to town to appear before the Treasury Committee on the Study of Oriental Languages. I told them that, in my opinion, professorships of Chinese and Japanese history, philology, literature, philosophy, and religions might usefully be established if they could obtain the right sort of men for such chairs. Only 4 men could be professor of Japanese: Aston, Basil Hall Chamberlain, Dickins, and Gubbins, I suppose. He mentioned it was 4 men, but he didn't name them. Writing a chapter on Japan for the Cambridge Modern History, he refers to this in his letter of 29th March 1908. But when I have done this contribution for the Cambridge people, like you, I shall turn aside from Japan and read modern history, that of Italy, for choice. So the evidence is there that he was turning his back on Japan. He writes in 1909, Gubbins paid me a visit from the 12th to the 19th, and we had much talk about modern Japanese politics, of which he probably knows more than anyone. Satow read one of his lectures to be given at Oxford and found it excellent. Satow tells Dickins he has several books on the Christian century in Japan and can lend them for a lecture at Bristol University in 1911. He describes the harakiri of General Nogi as a reversal to paganism in 1912. He tells Dickins that the Athenaeum has begun to send books on Japan for review as well as Chinese. He gives up Chinese reviews as time-consuming and poorly paid in 1913. And after sending books to Cambridge, he sells almost all his remaining books on Japan at Sotheby's for £677 in 1913. These are all in letters to Dickins. Now we have Aston, William George Aston. He died 18 years before Satow, but there are letters surviving from Satow to him in the period 1906 to 11. He retired near to Satow in Beer. It's a small village on the south coast of England. In 1908, Satow writes about Japanese history, lists of daimyos, books on Japan, and of the US consul Townsend Harris, that he was a very interesting person. How cleverly he used the English and French as a bugbear to frighten the Japanese into at last signing the treaty. That's the Treaty of 1858. On the 15th of June, 1908, Satow sends his chapter for the Cambridge Modern History to Aston for his critical comments. And on July 2nd, he thanks Aston for his comments. And Satow thanks Aston for an article and notes that Bushido was used as a word in the 18th century, which rather contradicts what Chamberlain says, I think, in his Things Japanese. He expresses alarm to Aston that Japan is going to reconstruct the Antung Mukden Railway in spite of Chinese opposition. He says that George Ernest Morrison used to be pro-Japanese and is now anti. He thanks Aston for his suggestions about Japanese bird names, which are excellent. This is in August 1909. And here is, I think, the only likeness of Aston that we actually have. Okay, Lord Reay. Satow first met him on May the 11th, 1907. They were both delegates at the Hague Peace Conference, British delegates, and they became close friends. Reay had been a colonial administrator in India. He was Dutch-born but naturalized British. He was head of the Mackay clan and he had no Japan experience. Reay asked Satow about international lawyer Takahashi Sakue in 1908. He asked about the Japanese tariff in 1910. He asked whether Satow had read Puli's Japan at the Crossroads in 1917, and he mentions an interview in the Daily Mail with Kato Takaaki in 1918. He asks Satow's opinion of Japanese claims on Shantung in 1919. He regrets that Satow does not consider a war between Japan and the US inconceivable in 1921. And here's a rather good portrait of Lord Reay in his later years. So Sato, in his letters to Reay, mentions Japanese verbal assurance to restrict immigration to US and British Columbia in 1907. He mentions professors of Japanese history and literature in 1908. He says Takahashi Sakue is a good writer. He discusses the Japanese tariff, probably in response to Reay, I would say, as we've seen. Sato says General Nogi's suicide will not be admired in Japan in 1912. He's negative about Francis Brinkley and says the triple intervention of 1895 led to the Russo-Japanese War. He refuses to give a paper requested by Reay on Japanese history at Congress and recommends Gubbins or Dickins instead. And he regrets there is no learned man in the chair of Japanese anywhere in Britain in 1913. Sato is contacted by the Japanese ambassador Inoue Katsunosuke to give a reference for Thomas Batty as an international lawyer in 1915. He says the Russo-Japanese War for the first time admitted internment of belligerent war vessels in neutral ports, and says Hayashi's, sorry, I can't read that bit. Hayashi's secret memoirs are not worth getting. Sato says that Redesdale's book, that's Mitford, became Lord Redesdale, has too much about his translations of Japanese state papers, most already printed in the Foreign Office confidential print. Says he and Redesdale had a very good time in Japan. It was the time of my life. Nothing ever came up to it, not even Morocco or Peking. Has had a Dutch grammar for 60 years, but in Far East, Chinese and Japanese occupied all his time. Sato notes the change in Japanese government may delay sending troops to Siberia in 1918. He says the Japanese willingly entered war in 1914 to turn the Germans out of Tsingtao. He can't understand the views of Kato in the Daily Mail and says Gubbins is the only man outside the Foreign Office who knows what is happening in Japan as he reads Japanese newspapers. And Japan is very ambitious to occupy Siberia. This is 1918. He mentions Dyer, Milne, and Ayrton of the Imperial College of Engineering, Tokyo in 1918, October letter, and says A.J. Balfour's tribute to Japanese allies will be appreciated there in November 1918. These are all letter dates, of course. And he mentions some U-boats handed over to Japan on Christmas Day, 1918. Sato writes he is busy revising manuscript of My Story of Japan in the 1860s. He writes in 1920. He distrusts the political ambitions of Japan wanting racial equality in 1921. He notes the speech of the Navy minister on naval program as very menacing and says the Anglo-Japanese alliance is now out of date in February 1921. And he says he got many invitations for the visit of the Crown Prince of Japan, but finds traveling uncomfortable, dislikes wearing uniform and decorations, and has forgotten a lot of Japanese. So that's why he didn't go to Buckingham Palace to the dinner there, mentioned previously. Okay, so Lionel Berners Cholmondeley was an Anglican priest and missionary in Japan from 1887 to 1921. He frequently wrote to Sato from Tokyo. There are 79 letters from him in the latter's general retirement correspondence. For example, he writes on August 9th, 1916 about Lake Chuzenji. Now to the main purport of my letter, for I am writing to tell you that I have been to Chuzenji again for the first time since I was your guest in your newly built house. That would be 1896. Our embassy have now practically established a summer colony there. In fact, Cholmondeley first came up to Chuzenji on August the 11th, 1896, as we see in Sato's Chuzenji diary. Then there are letters to and from the Japanese family, Sato's Japanese family, which are in the Yokohama Archives of History, the Kaikōshi Ryokan, Yokohama Kaikōshi Ryokan. And there has been a catalogue produced by Nakatake Kanami-san. Sato's second son, Takeda Hisayoshi, was in England from 1910 to 1916. at Birmingham University and the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. He visited Satow at Ottery, St. Mary, especially at Christmas. And he is known for his campaign to preserve the Ose marshes in Japan. And here he is, photograph. He was an academic at Hokkaido University and Kyoto University, and also a mountain climber, which he shared with his father. As regards the great Kanto earthquake of September the 1st, 1923, Satow was concerned about his family and relieved when he heard they were safe. He wrote in English to Okane on February the 17th, telling her to have Hisayoshi record the cost of house repairs and arrange to send money to them for the repairs. Professor Robert Morton writes in his foreword to my edition of the 1921-26 diaries, there is indeed remarkably little mention of his Japanese family. His common law wife, Takeda Okane, or Takeda Kane, is never referred to by name. It looks like he did what he saw as his duty towards his Japanese family, but nothing more. Sometimes in previous diaries, he writes OK for Okane. And here are some more diary entries. 1921, March 29th. Satow's close friend Alan Shand, formerly a banker in Japan, drives over to Ottery with Hayashi Gonsuke, the Japanese ambassador. He told us a good deal about what had taken place in Korea when he was minister there. In his time, the war with Russia broke out. He went to Peking as minister in 1906, and that must have been when I met him last. He is an Aizu man. His grandfather and father were killed fighting at Fushimi in January 1868. And in 1923, Satow lunches with Shand and Hayashi Gonsuke in Exeter. On January the 2nd, 1924, Shand gives Satow photos of the destruction wrought by the earthquake of September the 1st, 1923 in Tokyo, Yokohama, and Odawara. In June 1922, Shand and Ida, that's his daughter, or one of his daughters, motored over to lunch with Prince and Princess Shimazu. She told me she was a daughter of Tokudaiji, the Lord High Chamberlain of the Emperor Mutsuhito, that's the Meiji Emperor, whom I knew very well. Shimazu's father I met at Kyoto in 1868 when I went there with old Willis, Dr. William Willis, who was lent to attend to the Satsuma wounded. We had coffee in the loggia. This is part of Satow's retirement house. And I showed them my Japanese shrubs, some of which they did not appear to know. And who was Shimazu, Prince Shimazu Tadashige, the son of Shimazu Tadayoshi, naval officer in England at his own expense, 1921 to 23. And his wife was the daughter of Tokudaiji Sanetsune. Satow asks Harold Powlett, the counselor at the Tokyo embassy, to send him a Japanese translation of Dante's works in 10 volumes by Nakayama Masaki in 1925. And Powlett replies that he has bought them. It arrives on the 11th of March, 1926. He examines some volumes the next day and for several days after that. On May the 3rd, he writes to Dante author Paget Toynbee about the translation. And on September the 1st, 1926, he starts reading Toynbee's Dante in English literature. The last known diary entry on December the 31st, 1926, in which friends and acquaintances who died during the year are listed, as was the case from 1911 onwards, includes a Japanese name, Viscount Kawamura Kageaki of Kagoshima. He was a field marshal in the Imperial Japanese Army whose death was reported in the Express and Echo of Exeter, the local newspaper, not far from Ottery. Well, Exeter is in fact the county town of Devon, on April 28th, 1926. Then we should not forget Honma Saburo of Echigo province, now part of Niigata prefecture. He was Satow's faithful manservant for almost 50 years until Satow died. He was first hired before Satow left Japan at the end of 1882 and is mentioned as carrying baggage in Satow's diary for 16th of January 1881. He was the person who informed Takeda Kane, or Okane-san, by a letter written in katakana of Satow's death. The letter is now in the Takeda archive at the Yokohama Archives of History. Okane-san died on the 16th of January 1932, age 78. In his will, Satow made provision for Satow's affair to return to Japan. Then Satow kept Japanese shrubs and trees around him. He was a keen botanist and kept some Japanese shrubs and cherry trees in his garden at Beaumont House, Ottery, St. Mary. These would have been a constant reminder of his former life in Japan. He included many newspaper cuttings in his diary, including one from the Japan Times of March 31st, 1915, which stated that the person who had planted the cherry trees outside the British legation in Tokyo had since died. Satow was the planter, and he wrote, "Not yet," in the margin. This is the diary for May 19th, 1915, and the trees are still there today. So, to come to a conclusion, obviously Britain was and is a long way from Japan, and in Satow's time, communication was much slower than now. A letter might take about a month by sea, and telegram was much faster but more cryptic. Satow's Japanese family was still in Japan, Takeda Kane, Takeda Hisayoshi, except for his eldest son Eitaro in Colorado for his health, weak lungs. And alas, Eitaro died in 1926 before his father. We could not expect a retired man to take an active interest in a country so far away, yet in his discussions with Gubbins and Dickins, we do see that he has not lost his academic interest in Japanese language, literature, and culture. However, he regards European literature as superior and spends most of his time on that. He becomes wary of Japanese ambitions for racial equality, domination of the Pacific, and immigration to the US and Canada. He begins to learn Russian during the First World War after his cousin Lysinka sends him War and Peace in Russian. He reads Dutch, Italian, French, German, and Greek, but almost no Japanese. He was fully committed to English life. He attended innumerable local committees, housing committees, hospital committees, etc., and was a magistrate in Ottery and on the county bench at Exeter. For a while, he was chairman of the Ottery Council, the Urban District Council, so-called, in 1916 to 17. He was a strong supporter of the work of missionary societies in India, China, and Africa, and church administration in Britain. He spoke at missionary society events and regularly attended church in Ottery and Exeter at the cathedral. We have to conclude that while he did not totally turn his back on Japan, it certainly occupied his mind and energies much less in retirement, except of course for the completion and publication of A Diplomat in Japan, published in 1921, which was written about the best time in his life, as he felt. Here's a blue plaque outside the house, Beaumont House at Ottery St. Mary. So the local heritage society is interested in Satow. Here's a select bibliography, and that is the end. Thank you very much for listening.